We'll start in 5 minutes, waiting for a few more people to join. Asim, I think you can share your screen meanwhile if you want, and you can just set it up and test it. Hi, Asim. I think you can share your screen. We'll start in 2 minutes.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Just let me know if it's visible.
So, just to give you an introduction, I'm Rehan, co-founder of OneLearn.io, and we conduct these data talks every weekend, right? And Asim has been my colleague in the past, and currently he's the director of engineering at RE Connect Energy, and he's going to present today's talk on data and AI in power sector. Okay, I'll talk about what OneLearn.io is also at the end of the session. Asim, I think you can just give a brief introduction of yourself, and then I think you can start the session.
Okay, sure. Okay, so good afternoon to everyone who's here. Thank you for joining. So just an intro about myself. I'm currently working at Reconnect Energy, which is a Bangalore-based company. We're no longer officially a startup, but we're still functioning like a startup. we're working in the space of digital technology for energy and power sector. So within this, my role is that I work on the data-based tech development as well as the weather-based tech development, and the two are quite interrelated as we'll see. So I've been working here since 2014, and before this, I was working as a researcher at University of Manchester, which is where I also studied. So my background is actually not in computer science or in data science. I'm an electrical engineer and a master's in power sector. So with that, I think we'll start. Rehan will start.
Yeah, we can start now.
Okay, sure. So just as a brief overview of what we will be covering today, to start with, I'll give you all a background of the sector itself. What is the power sector? What are the different aspects within the value chain here? And then we'll look at the different types of data that are generated within this sector. And then what are the applications that can be built using that data? And then within those applications, what is the use of AI or data science in those applications? Then moving on to that, I'll be putting a little bit more focus on the last couple of slides where I'm talking about the kind of job roles that we have here within this company, and in general as well, what are the expectations that we have from people that we hire, as well as while you're working here day to day, what would be the expectations, and some insights that I can give you from the hiring that I've done over the last 7 years for this company and within my team. Okay, so let's start with the power systems background. So there might be some people within this session that who already have an understanding of this, but just for the benefit of everyone else, a power system is, when we're talking about power systems, we're talking about consumption, generation, transmission and distribution, and then consumption of electrical energy. In this, these are the three major components. Before these three major components, there is one aspect of the value chain, which is the source of energy, the procurement of the energy. That is one aspect that I will not be focusing on. So it could be coal-based generation, it could be different types of generation technologies. What is the input source or the fuel source for energy generation is part of the value chain, but I will not be focusing too much on that. The three components after that would be the generation of electrical energy using some input fuel source. And then once the energy has been generated, the transmission and distribution of that, getting the energy to the end user, and then at the consumption side. So these are the three major components within the power system. And one thing that we should all be aware of is that the power system that we have, not just here in India, but globally, is a dynamic system. And what I mean by dynamic system is that it is always, it has a characteristic which is always changing, which needs to be managed with real-time operations. So to kind of give you a better understanding of that. So let's look at it this way. So if we talk about energy generation, the net energy generated must always be equal to the net energy consumed at any given time. This is the nature of the power systems. And this is largely because of certain events that have happened in the past, that alternating current technology was the predominantly applied technology because it allows for lower losses in transmission. I mean, if you look back in history with the entire period of Thomas Edison in the 19th century, I believe, where he had invented the first power system and then applied it in Manhattan area. That was a direct current system in which the power was generated and then distributed within a small geographic area. And because it was a small area, it was viable. As soon as the distances become larger, when you want to transmit energy over larger distances, electrical energy over larger distances, the direct current system essentially becomes too inefficient. There's too many losses along the way. And for that reason, the adopted system has been the AC system. And within the AC system, it's kind of like the way I like to see it is a tug of war, in which you have generation on one side and consumption on the other side. And this has to always be balanced. If generation exceeds consumption, or if consumption exceeds generation, you end up with an imbalance in the system and you risk collapsing the entire or some part of the system. So this is kind of what I'm trying to represent here with the net generation should be equal to the net consumption at any given time. And this is a primary characteristic of the power system, which we need to understand, because this kind of leads into a lot of the different applications within the power system that we have. The infinity symbol here, which I've represented in between, is kind of the grid, the electrical grid, which connects all the different sources and the points of consumption. So yeah, so on this, if we see the history of the power systems, majority of the transmission and distribution infrastructure was actually put up post World War II. That was the time when there was a large amount of resources which were mobilized, and entire nations went into a whole development activity, and economic growth was really good. And at this time is when a lot of the infrastructure was put up for transmission and distribution systems. Distribution systems over time have kept evolving. There have been new and new additions, increases, but the physical systems that have been laid down, aside from the regular maintenance and replacement, those systems have remained. It's very unlikely now that we will see large-scale overhauling of those systems. Those are kind of in place. The focus now within the power sector has been on improving efficiency of those systems and then identifying where are the areas where we can bring in IT technologies in order to improve this. And this is where the whole concept of smart grids and so on is evolving. So given that this is kind of like a background, what are we looking at now and in the future in terms of what are the changes that we see in the power system? One of the major things is that we are seeing a greater and greater share of renewable energy coming in, especially in India. So as of today, I believe it is 25% of the total installed capacity is renewable energy generation capacity. But that 25% also includes hydro generation. So even if we exclude hydro generation, it would still be a sizable number. I think it's about 70 to 72 gigawatts in total, which would be around 18 to 19% or so. And then the other trends that we are seeing is that there's more and more distributed generation, meaning that you can have small scale generation in certain pockets, like say, for example, solar rooftops. And this would be meeting the localized needs of a particular area, and the surplus of that could be put back into the grid. But it could also be used, captive in the sense that it's generated in a specific area and then used within that area. And that introduces a new aspect or dimension to the entire sector. This is also on the rise. Demand side management is where we are looking at managing the consumption side. So generation is something which is always has been controlled with the exception of renewables. But now with new technologies coming in and with the onset of IT within the power system, there is also a possibility to have management on the demand side, which is largely considered something that is not managed. And to kind of give you an idea of this, it's when we consume energy in our houses or in our offices, there is no control over when we want to use the energy. If we choose to switch on the lights at 3 a.m. at night, we can do that. And we expect the lights to come on. That is not something that is it's not elastic. It's just something that has to be met. And this being the case, the demand side of it is what brings in some uncertainty into the entire system. And that has to be met by managing the generation side of it so that the generation and the demand is always in balance. And also we are seeing that there's greater and greater market flexibility coming in through regulations and opening up of the market, unbundling of the entire sector. We can go into more details of this, but it is not too relevant to the topic that we have on hand. So I'll kind of leave this to questions later if anyone wants to. So yeah, so moving on to the sources and types of data that we see within the power systems. So we'll start with the local sensing data. So to give you an overview, local sensing data, remote sensing data, administrative data, and climate and weather simulation data is the broad categorization that I have done. Within this, I have put certain fields within administrative data, which perhaps could be labeled as something else also. It's just my categorization to kind of make it easier to understand. So when we're talking about local sensing data, largely what we are talking about is data from on-ground sensors which have been deployed. These sensors could be monitoring a lot of things. And I use the word sensors also here kind of loosely because I'm also including in this energy meters. So they are a kind of sensor, so to speak, where they are sensing how much energy is being consumed at any given point. Along with that, you have SCADA systems which are measuring how much is the generation at a particular point. So for those who have not come across this term SCADA before, what it refers to is a supervisory control and data acquisition. What this means is it's basically a microcontroller or a micro technology based system which allows you to monitor different processes as well as actuate on those, meaning that you can give commands to the SCADA system to turn off or on a boiler within an industry, or you can give commands to switch on or switch off a particular feeder within a distribution grid. It could be a command to turn off a generator, could be a wind turbine generator, it could be a coal plant. So all of these are kind of controlled using these SCADA systems. And these systems have in place all of the sensors which are at all times monitoring data. The frequency of monitoring can be ranging from milliseconds up to once every few hours. Along with this, AWS here refers to the automatic weather stations. And this is a point that I'd like to kind of take a second to stress on, that power and energy systems are extremely interlinked with weather. This is because a lot of, on the demand side, if we speak, a lot of consumption patterns are dependent on weather. Say, for example, electricity consumption because of air conditioning in Chennai would be strongly linked with what is the season. Similarly, in countries like European countries like UK, for example, a larger amount of gas consumption is happening in the winter time. And it matters a lot because when you consider these things, these are central factors which play into how the power systems are planned and how they are operated. Because let's take that example of, say, energy being at its peak consumption at winter time in Europe. That would be also the same time where the days are the shortest. And in Europe, that can mean really short days, could be 7 hours of daylight at most. And so in those countries, having solar generation as a major contributor would not really work, because you're getting very less contribution from solar during winter time, and winter time is when you would see a majority of the demand rise. So weather has a very strong role to play, and this is especially so with the case of renewable energies like wind and solar coming into play, because they are entirely dependent on weather, and it's uncontrollable. When the wind blows, you get wind energy. When the sun shines, you get solar energy. So along with the local sensing data, we also have remote sensing data that we use within this. So in remote sensing data, there's meteorological satellites, which are basically geostationary satellites, which are observing the Earth's atmosphere and the hydrosphere at all times. And this data can be utilized within the systems to kind of keep a close eye on what's happening in terms of the weather and climate. The Earth imaging satellites are largely the low Earth orbit satellites, which orbit the Earth multiple times. And these are just taking images of the Earth from closer range. So these are I'm talking about optical images, which could be RGB spectrum images of the Earth. Then we have the administrative data. So under administrative data, I've just put together market data, say, for example, because it is possible to buy and sell electricity within markets. This has been enabled through some regulations and through the system being completely dynamic system where you can generate anywhere and the same energy can be consumed anywhere. It's possible to kind of abstract away the accounting process from the physical process. And by doing so, we can have markets. And what these markets are similar to a stock market. What these markets allow us to do is that we are able to buy and sell power on a market on a real-time basis or on a day-ahead basis and so on. And this data is also feeding into the entire power system, because this kind of informs the way that a lot of the generators or even the utilities operate. The other kind of data that we might see is that within utility, there are contracts and documents. All of this is data that power utilities have to deal with. Field imaging data is something that we have come across recently, but it does exist. So it's kind of, to give you an example, one application is where a distribution company, now a distribution company is a company which is providing you electricity at a retail level. So in Bangalore, for example, Bescom is the distribution company. Bescom might want to automate the process of bill collection at certain points to make it more efficient. So rather than, as the current system, they send out a field technician who goes out and he takes a reading from the meter, goes back, uploads that data, and then using that data, a bill is generated. What could happen is they could just go and take a photo of the meter. And from that photo, you can have a system which is reading the photo, trying to identify what is the bill. And basis of that, a bill is generated. The process becomes faster and it's a lot easier. Or it could be a lot easier. There's also associated challenges that come with that. And then finally, we have the climate and weather simulation data. So this, what I mean by simulation data is that it's forward-looking. This is not observational data which has been measured. This is predicted data which is of the future weather outcomes. So let's go a little deeper into this climate and weather simulation data, because it's a adjacent field. It's very relevant within the power and energy sector, but also relevant to a lot of other sectors. So this field of climate and weather simulations is also an interesting one to look at from a historical point of view. So there's this nice quote that I read from a book called The Weather Machine, where basically the observation is that when you have technologies that enable transfer or movement of information faster than the development of weather patterns, then the weather patterns need not be a surprising occurrence anymore. We should not have to be surprised by the onset of rainfall in the next 3 hours, considering the fact that we are able to observe those clouds from space at a prior location, and we are able to transmit that information faster than it takes for the clouds to move to another location. So this is kind of the enabling factor for weather forecasting and climate forecasting, because it is possible with computational advances and with the communications advances to be able to get a projection of the future weather. And in this, if we see the history, so it actually started off as a pattern matching problem, similar to what we consider as data science. So earlier in the day, when this first started out, what used to happen was there were different agencies scattered across, and this is the case of the United States, where it was one of the first few places where it was experimented with. There were different postal agencies who used to observe what is the weather at their location and then send that as a telegram to a central repository. And then the central location at which all those messages were received, they were all recorded, and on a map it was plotted with the location map as well as informing what was the observed weather at that location. And then they created these maps on a every day basis, every 6 hour basis. And then what they did when they wanted to do a projection of the future was, once you have enough of a history piled up, they used to see, okay, what is the observations for today? And basis of that, they try and go look in the past of all the maps that they have, which is the closest matching pattern that we saw to what we see today. And basis of that, they would kind of decide that, okay, if this is what we see today, in the past, the day after a similar pattern was this kind of weather, hence this must be the kind of weather prediction for tomorrow. It started off there, but then it evolved later that it is not necessary that history repeats itself with the case of weather. There are repeating patterns, but the fundamental factors underlying weather are different. Actually, it's physical processes within the atmosphere that are driving this, and this was kind of contributed to by a Norwegian meteorologist called Bjørknes, who through his contributions enabled something called numerical weather prediction. Now, numerical weather prediction is basically a 4-dimensional simulation of the Earth from a atmosphere and a hydrosphere point of view. So basically what is happening in the atmosphere around us and in the ocean systems. This 4-dimensional simulation basically takes a current snapshot of what is the current weather conditions at different locations. And then from that, it does a forward simulation using a certain set of equations, the Navier-Stokes equation and the mass continuity equation. So this is what numerical weather prediction is. It's not a data science related field, but recently what has started happening is that there has been a greater effort to kind of try and understand what can data science bring to the field in terms of efficiency and so on. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. Okay, so now looking at the database applications within the power sector. So if we kind of split the value chain, as I was talking about earlier, where we have generation, transmission and distribution and consumption. Here transmission and distribution has been separated into two things. The difference being that transmission is at a larger scale, meaning higher voltages, larger currents flowing through it on a grid, as opposed to distribution, where you're talking about at lower voltages, and this is more intended to kind of deliver the last mile of energy to the consumer, electrical energy to the consumer. And within these different points in the value chain, different applications exist. So if we look at generation side, there's a whole bunch of, so I'll just move on to the next slide. So on the generation side, what are the different applications that we can have which are based on data? VRE forecasting is one. So VRE here refers to variable renewable energy forecasting, where we are talking about predicting what is going to be the generation of a wind or a solar power plant ahead of time. It could be 15 days ahead, could be 7 days ahead, could be a few hours ahead, and so on. And it could even be up to 9 months ahead. And this, again, the reason this needs to be done is because it's a dynamic system, and that's not going to change. The generation has to always match the supply. And to maintain this, the only way to do it is if we kind of know in advance what is going to be the demand and what is going to be the supply. The other aspect that could apply to the generation side is predictive maintenance. When you are looking at, say, if we stick to the renewable energy applications, you have wind turbines, which are very large investment technology. To put up a wind turbine costs a lot of money, and if you're putting up 100 or 120 wind turbines, which is quite common in India, you're looking at hundreds of crores of investment. And in those, if a fault occurs on a turbine, if there is a crack on a blade, that can represent a significant loss. So in order to avoid that, we can have applications where we are constantly monitoring what is the data being received from the sensors on those turbines and try and predict that if a fault is going to occur. And before the fault occurs, you try and take action and do some maintenance activity so that you don't it doesn't result in a loss. The other aspect is remote monitoring of systems, where you don't need on-ground people and devices to be able to see what exactly is happening. Revenue optimization is another aspect which is quite a big area actually within generation side, where they want to see how much can they maximize their revenues from generation based on the data that they are collecting. This could apply to solar power plants, wind power plants, hydro power plants, as well as some conventional ones like coal and gas based. So within the transmission and distribution, demand forecasting is the most basic one, where you can apply data based technologies, where you are trying to estimate what is the electrical demand consumption going to be in the future. Again, this is needs to be done for the purpose of maintaining the generation and consumption balance within the grid. Another aspect is asset monitoring. So transmission and distribution systems again involve the transmission lines, the overhead lines that you see for the transmission, as well as for the distribution, which are the smaller lines that we see lined across the roads. The transmission lines here especially and the transformers that are associated with them, again, very high value assets. A lot of money needs to be invested to put up these assets. It's very critical to kind of maintain and ensure that these assets are not damaged, and a lot of them are exposed to the atmosphere. So the asset monitoring through database systems and applying AI here is also a possibility. I've specified vegetation maps here because this is a requirement that comes up quite often, because when you have transmission lines going across countries, one of the issues that the owners of these transmission lines face is that they have vegetation growing within the area of the transmission lines. And this, if it grows to a large enough size, can interfere with the system itself. So that they go through regular maintenance processes where they have to clear out the vegetation. And for this, they might be spending a lot of money by doing surveys. There's newer approaches to this, which would be flying drones to kind of map what is the vegetation. And within that also, there is some database applications that can be developed. Another aspect is the monitoring of the vegetation through satellite imaging. And extreme weather is another issue that we as a company have seen has happened, that if we remember the cyclones that India has been subjected to, it is subjected to every year. We have post-monsoon cyclones every year in India. And those cyclones sometimes can have devastating impacts on entire communities. And within those communities would also be these high value assets, which need to be protected, or at least some advance warning of an event of extreme weather would help utilities a lot. Another aspect is dispatch optimization and market participation. This is referring to the utilities which are involved in the transmission and distribution of electrical energy are also involved in managing the demand supply balance, as you were talking about earlier, and they do this through buying and selling power over contracts, as well as through market buying and selling. And the revenues are largely dependent on how this happens. So this is an aspect which can be controlled through optimized dispatch, which again is a data-driven process. So on the consumption side, what we can have, the different applications that we can be looking at is meter analytics for one. This is the data collected at every meter, at every house or every office, or say residential, commercial, whatever consumption points there are. There are meters installed at each and every one of those locations. And all of those meters are collecting data. That is a very rich source of data. Within that, a lot can be done. We can try and identify which consumers have similar patterns, which consumers have different patterns, and which of those consumers are more dependent on weather, which of those consumers are not so dependent on weather, and how do they behave on different days. Someone, say a house of a working family, has a different consumption profile on weekends than they do on weekdays, as opposed to a house with just a say, a couple of bachelors living, their consumption profile would be very different from another residential metering point which has a family with kids and so on. So this kind of analytics helps a lot when we go further down into optimization of revenues and looking at energy efficiency measures and so on. So this is something that can be done using data. Disaggregation here refers to within a particular house, we try and identify what are the different devices that are using energy. Why you would want to do this could be for several reasons. I mean, demand side management, like I was saying. So if we want to move to a future where we are able to kind of control demand or have dynamic pricing, say, for example, we want to say that energy prices are changing throughout the day. There are some points during the day when there's not a lot of people consuming energy, and at that time the price is lower. So you would want to be able to give some signal to a consumer saying that rather than using your washing machine at 7 a.m. in the morning, which is a peak consumption time, rather maybe you should use it at night when no one else is using the energy. And for you as a consumer, it will be cheaper. For a utility who is trying to do the demand supply balance, it would be very useful for them to be able to have this option, because then it allows them to control the demand as well to some degree, in addition to controlling the generation. So disaggregation would help with things like that, where you are trying to identify what are the different devices used within a particular household. And this could be even a completely automated process where you have a device sitting in your house, which is automatically optimizing for your own costs, electricity bills, at what time should a particular device be used and so on. Prosumer apps here refers to this concept of prosumer is basically someone who is producing as well as consuming energy at the same location. So if you say put up a few solar panels on your house, you are producing energy as well as consuming energy, and within the market frameworks, it is also possible to sell that energy back to the grid. So this again is a domain where data applications could apply very heavily. Battery energy management system and energy efficiency are other areas where this works. So this is kind of like a brief overview of all the different applications that exist, which would be based on data. And if you notice that not all these applications require machine learning or data science. Some of them do. Within these applications, data science and machine learning could be used selectively or exclusively just as the main value adding factor, but not always. So I'd like to give you an example of like a advanced application of machine learning. But before that, I mean, to speak about the AI applications or machine data science applications within the sector, there's three types largely. We have regression, classification, and computer vision. Regression here, I'm referring to basically estimating numerical values of different data points within the value chain. So within the generation side, it could be estimating what is the net generation going to be. On the consumption side, it could be what is the net demand going to be. It could, from a classification point of view, what we are looking at is clustering. So fault prediction, what we were talking about earlier, is also a kind of classification problem where you are basically identifying, is it a fault, yes or no? Clustering is basically when, say, we take the example of meter analytics data. If we are able to identify different consumer profiles, how their energy consumption patterns are, and kind of club them together in terms of their behavior, this is something which can be done using clustering methods. Computer vision is used for nowcasting, which is the example that I'll go a little bit more deeper into. And remote asset monitoring, again, using satellite imaging. Other applications of computer vision could be, as I said, the field data. If someone is taking a photo of a meter and sending it back to the utility, the photo can be processed to kind of read what is the energy meter data, and then store that data automatically. That could be another application of computer vision. So I've picked one example here of nowcasting using meteorological satellite imaging. I've chosen this as an example just to give an idea of what is possible and what would be the value add from having advanced AI within these systems. So I'll just play this video. It's playing now. So this is kind of looking at a location in Gujarat. So the red marker that you see is a site of a particular solar generation power plant. And the images are taken from a geostationary meteorological satellite, which is observing cloud movements at a particular location. So what you are seeing, each frame is basically 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, a new image of what is the cloud pattern over the particular region of interest. And when it goes dark, it's basically nighttime, it will go bright again. We see there are cloud movements. And the one point to note here is that the red marker that you see, it's actually much larger than the size of the solar plant which is installed on the ground. The red marker is made bigger just to kind of show it on the image. But the solar power plant is actually smaller than the size of a single pixel. Each pixel here refers to a 3 by 3 square kilometer area. So if you see, this is going to continue playing. What you see on the right-hand side of this is the actual generation pattern of that particular solar power plant, as well as the estimated generation based on the cloud imaging data that we see here. So the blue line is the actual generation data, and the yellow line is the estimated generation based on the cloud images. So you can see it actually matches quite closely. And what this allows us to do is it removes, first of all, the need to have local sensing at every particular site where we want to monitor. And if we see here, the site of interest is actually quite small. Over that entire area of Gujarat, in total, there's a lot many more solar power plants installed. It is in the order of about 60 to 70, I believe, or maybe more. So all of those could be monitored using a single image at a particular time. And these images are instantly received by us. The other application of this is that using this, we are able to do a prediction of cloud movements through applying neural networks. And that then helps to be more accurate in terms of the predictions. And those predictions would be extremely valuable for a utility which is trying to manage the supply. So if you see the first day here, or even the second day is a little bit more interesting. We see that there's a spike in the middle of the day and then kind of a drop. Now, this is something that would be close to impossible to predict a day in advance. The numerical weather prediction techniques, which are kind of doing simulations of the weather, would be able to capture a general pattern of what might happen tomorrow. But at the end of the day, those are simulations, right? And for a utility which is trying to manage the demand and supply balance, this rise and fall in generation is a serious problem for them. Because what this means is that within that 1 hour period, they have to manage. So this is a smaller site, but as you see in the video here, it is impacting actually all of Gujarat. It's very heavy cloud movement. So this kind of drop in generation we would be seeing across all solar sites in Gujarat. So in the utility in Gujarat would be dealing with this issue on a live basis. They see that, okay, there is a drop in solar generation. And because of this drop in solar generation, if there is at the same time energy being consumed by the users, this generation, which is now no longer available from solar plants because of the clouds, has to be met through some other supply. And this they have to manage on a real-time basis. So some planning around this can be done on a day in advance. But even this 2 hour ahead lead time that we can give by looking at the clouds and trying to estimate what is the future generation going to be, that 2 hour lead time for them could be extremely valuable in terms of being prepared to procure that supply and then meet that supply through demand. In case they don't, what they may be looking at is that they are having to cut down some of the demand, that they are not able to meet that demand. And because of that, it's a revenue loss for them. So even this small intervention here can lead to large differences from a business point of view. Okay, so on this project specifically, I'll just go a little bit deeper into how is it structured as a database project. So, okay, so this is kind of the base modeling that we do. You have numerical weather prediction data, which is weather forecast data, and then using that you build a machine learning based regression model, which gives you a prediction of what is going to be the solar output. Right. This is the first layer. The most basic kind of thing that we could possibly do. In addition to this, what we can add is we can add the local sensing data. So if we have data from the solar generation site itself, we are getting that data and we are looking at data, and using that data, we can improve the predictions. It can be of higher accuracy by including this data. So that would be another layer. The third layer that we were talking about now here is we introduce the remote sensing data, which is being fed into a separate model. We use a convolution neural network model. This model puts out a nowcast, meaning a 0 to 3 hour ahead forecast of what is the cloud movement going to be for the future few hours. And then that nowcast is then fed into a different regression model, which uses this data in addition to the weather forecast data as well as the local sensing data to give a final prediction, which is more accurate. So this is kind of the structuring or the very high level overview of how this project is structured. But what is not visible here, and one of the points that I'd like to go a little bit deeper into, is that in order to do this, there's a lot more happening in terms of how the data is managed and who and what are the skills applied towards doing this. So that's what I want to kind of represent here. So just to be able to do this, we need to be able to procure all this data, sourcing of the data, and then that data needs to be processed. So this here DE refers to data engineering. So all of that data needs to be processed and stored in ready to access databases or data stores so that these models can then access that data to do the processing. And this processing happens on a live basis, that it happens several times a day. So all of this data kind of gets fed into the different models, and then the final output, the prediction, also gets stored into the database. So there's actually a lot more than this. I've just given a very simpler representation of this, but what I want to highlight through this is that in order to develop a final prediction, just that one prediction has many layers behind it and a lot of things going on. So leading from this, we kind of go into what are the different roles that we have within this data applications in the Power Center point of view. So the different roles that we have had in the past, we may not have all of these roles currently, but overall, these are the kind of roles that we've had. We've had analysts who kind of look at a problem statement or an objective that we want to work on, formulate it, identify what could be the possible solution to this. Along with that, we have to look at what are the different sources of data available to us, what additional data needs to be procured in order to be able to solve this, and kind of put a structure around using this data, applying a certain technology, this can be solved. Now this, the role of an analyst is not something, and in fact, not just this role, all of these roles are not job positions specifically, but these are roles that any person working in the team might have to take. So before we work on any project, whether it is me or someone within my team, they would have to take on all of these roles. You have to be an analyst first. And once you have done the analysis of the problem and proposed a solution, then you move on to the actual implementation of the solution. And in that implementation, the primary and fundamental requirement would be that you have to have solid programming or coding knowledge. This is something which is, it's not really a negotiable. Without this, it's not possible. So this has to be a focus area for a lot of the fundamental basis for what needs to be done to be built on top of this. Data engineering is another role that needs to be played by almost everyone within the team, where they are looking at the different sources of data. How is it possible to store this data efficiently and have it ready to access at any given time? Then the next aspect is the research engineer or ML engineer. This is where you're kind of working with the crux of the problem and trying to identify which machine learning technique or which deep learning method can be applied to solve a particular problem. Say, for example, for the case of cloud nowcasting, if you go with a convolution neural network, which architecture of the convolution neural network is going to work? How many data points do we need to look at in the past? What is the training cycle and so on? All of this is kind of the research engineering or ML engineering, but not just that. It then moves forward from that to, once we have a model developed, tested, we know it works, it needs to go into production also. If it does not go into production, all of the work that comes before it is completely useless. So putting it into production and maintaining it and operating it on a live basis is critically important. And that is also something that, at least within our company and within this team, we expect every person to be able to do that and work on that as well. This is not true for every company. Different companies structure in different ways, but a lot of companies do expect the engineers who are working on the data science aspect of it or the ML aspects of it to be able to put their models into production and maintain them and operate them also. There are much larger companies where the teams might be completely segregated, in the sense that there is a separate team which does only model development and then they hand it over to a deployment team, which then takes those models, understands them, makes it production ready, and then deploys it operationally. That is possible. It does happen in certain companies, but even in those cases, to have a smooth process, interactions between the model development team as well as the deployment team, it is important for each of those teams to kind of understand what is the process that's happening before. And to make that process smooth, it has to be transferable skills. Now, data scientist here, what I'm referring to is, and different people have different kind of definitions of this, but here, me personally, I'm referring to data scientist as a person who is working exclusively on the science aspect of the data, meaning that you look at all of the data and you build hypotheses, and then you test those hypotheses, and you're really looking at applying a scientific method to dealing with all of this data. This does happen. I mean, it is a role that needs to be played, but as a job exclusively, at least within our company, this is a non-existent thing. There is no one who's working exclusively just on working on applying scientific methods to data. And this is largely because there is a lot of other things that need to be done before it becomes viable as a business. And also, um, there are existing libraries and a lot of community knowledge, which kind of already gives you a very good starting point as to for development and deployment of models. Really looking at from a science point of view comes at a later stage. It's not something that would be needed initially, and it's only when you hit that barrier of is the model that we are building or is the application that we are building already at its maximum capacity, then you start looking into, okay, let's look under the hood and kind of go into the details of can we improve this, and does it make sense to do that? Does it make sense as a business to kind of spend resources in looking into the details of a particular model or not? So here, one thing that I wanted to highlight is we have to kind of differentiate between skills and roles. A skill in itself should not be considered a role overall. Skills are applied within different roles, but then this classification of what we consider skills and what we consider roles is kind of muddy. It's vague, right? It's not everyone will have the same definitions and not everyone will have the same understanding of this. So the way I like to see it is that analysis, coding, communications, comprehension, these are skills. These are prerequisite skills that are needed. The roles that we have within the company are kind of interchangeable because we do put tags on it. We say that, okay, research engineer is a position or data engineer is a position, but within this, it's not an exclusive position. There is some transferability of skills within these roles or within these positions. And what I have been seeing recently is that machine learning overall it is a role, but it is kind of slowly heading towards becoming a skill, not a position, so to speak, because it would be as common as something as coding, not very far down the line, is my understanding. Okay, so talking about now the expectations that we have from people working within the team and also at the time of hiring. This is kind of like a detailed understanding of what is our expectation when we have someone working within the team. So on the non-technical side, any person who joins or any person who's working, one of the first things that they need to do is build an understanding of the domain that we are working in and understand within that domain what are the business objectives that we are working with. And it's important here to stress that it's not just the problem objectives, but the business objectives. So I myself have been, not so focused on business objectives at times in the past, and I have to remind myself, that. So say for example, we're talking about working within the renewable industry, where you're working on a problem like integrating a greater number of renewables into the grid. Now that is a problem statement. The business statement might be, in order to do that, we have to have predictive models which are accurate to a certain degree. So it is important that we focus on the fact that the accuracy is important and to what degree is it important. If it's meeting that are going on for
Asim, I think you're breaking a little bit.
If I'm not audible or there's some issue.
We can hear you now. So, any questions still now from everyone? Like, Asim is almost at the end of the session. I think he'll just rejoin, but most of the part is complete. Like, any questions still now from anyone? You can write your questions also in the chat section.
Okay, sorry, I lost the connection.
Yeah, Asim.
Where did I drop out?
You were just talking about the expectations, right? Like in terms of business objective,
Right.
The process which you personally have been through, like.
Sure. Okay, I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay. Yeah. So business objectives is something that's important for any employee to understand, because all the efforts have to be kind of directed towards that, and understanding of that is the fundamental starting point for any project. So along with this, I mean, I've written this kind of to cover all aspects, even for people who may not have any computer science background, who have no experience working with software and building software systems and so on. So one of the things that's important working in this is analyzing problem statements in depth. And what that requires is, firstly, you have to get comfortable with the jargon. Every company, every team is going to be using certain words here and there. There will be terminology which is very specific to the job or to that company and to that sector. For people who are not from the sector or people who are new to working within that sector, you need to get comfortable with this as soon as possible. So the way to do this, in my opinion, would be speak to as many people as possible within your team. Initial days, spend time talking to people outside of the teams also, get an understanding of what are the different people working on within the teams and what are their objectives. Along with this, you need to understand what are the downstream and upstream processes involved. So if you are working as a someone who is a machine learning engineer building a machine learning model, it is important for you to understand what is the process that's happening before, who are the people working on getting the data to you, making it available to you. Once your model is developed, who are you handing over the model to? Or if you are deploying it in production, what is it being used for? Who is the final end user? What is the customer point of view and so on? So it's important to get all of this understanding. And another kind of non-negotiable expectation that we have is that whoever joins has to be very quick at learning and applying from community knowledge bases. So I think this would be a unanimous thing. Anyone would tell you that Google and Stack Overflow are basically the starting point for any problem solving that happens within this computer science or data-based applications domain. It's a really good resource. In say the last 7 years, with all the work that I have done, I can count on one hand the number of times that a solution has not been found by Google and Stack Overflow. It might take a little bit of time doing this, but usually the solutions are there. The community knowledge base here is very strong. Uh, it's an important skill to be able to tap into that knowledge base and do it fast. So from a technical point of view, the requirements would be fluency in programming. Like I said, it's the fundamental of everything. For people who are just coming from other domains and just looking into getting started with, say, data science or database applications, your first and foremost focus area should be programming. Get very comfortable with programming. You should be able to write codes which have nested loops, and you should know what is the different types of data types that exist within a programming language. And some concepts of object-oriented programming are important. It would help a lot, especially if you're working within this domain, because Python is an object-based language, right? Everything is an object. A lot of the libraries that you work with are all object-based. So to be able to understand how to use those libraries well, it's good to have an understanding of what is object-oriented programming. One point I missed actually here is that abstraction as a cognitive process. So this is, I'm not just talking here about abstraction within computer science. What I'm talking here about is looking at a particular problem or an objective and trying to distill it down to its very bare bones and identifying what is important and what is not important. This is something that humans do on a regular basis, uh, probably every day of their life, every few hours. But kind of being aware of this and then applying this same process into a business point of view, that if you're working in a particular business, apply abstraction and do this as a practice every day, I would say, to people who are especially new in this, because experienced programmers will do it very quickly. And this is one of the things that it's kind of lost in the learning process, that no one really talks about it much. But this is one of the critical skills, to be able to look at a problem statement and abstract away what is important, what is not important, the kind of bare bones of what you are dealing with. And for that particular problem statement, what are the different data points that you need to look at, or what is the information that would inform your decisions? So yeah, going back to the technical skills, fundamental mathematical and physics competency. Again, we test for this in every interview with some basic questions. You have to be able to pass this, and I'm not talking about like very advanced stuff. You don't need to know partial differentiation or calculus and things like this, but you do need to know. You should be able to do something like a weighted average on paper. Again, for fluency in programming also, the test that I personally do is I like to have people do some coding on paper rather than doing it in a coding environment. Just do it on paper and kind of test, are they able to debug without having the help of a compiler. These are the two most critical skills, but the other things that we also expect within company is that people should have some knowledge on, but this is also something that can be learned on the job. Job specific libraries, say for example, for our particular case of this company, NumPy, Pandas, Keras, PyTorch are the kind of libraries that we work with largely. It's important to be able to work with these libraries and then utilize them and deploy them in a manner in which you are able to meet the business objectives. In addition to this, because as we were saying earlier, that it's not just one particular role that you're going to be working on, it's multiple roles. And within that multiple roles, it is important to have some computing and software development competencies as well. This is just kind of some of the things that we would like people to know. And if they are working within the team over a period of time, it would be inevitable that they build these competencies. Working with, say, a Linux environment, operating system, Linux as the operating system, Windows and Mac if you're working with the Apple system, you're anyway working on Linux. Job scheduling is something that you should be having some knowledge of. What is parallel processing? How do we deploy systems in production so that they work efficiently and that you are maximizing the resources that you are using, the computing resources? Virtual environments for doing your development work and putting it into deployment is something very important. Version control, again, an important thing to know. How do you interact with databases, different types of databases? So it can be object-based storage, SQL, MySQL databases, NoSQL, and so on. Some understanding of cloud infrastructure always helps. There's different platforms. You have Amazon, Google, and Azure, and so on. But a lot of those concepts are the same across platforms. And project structuring is another thing that is important to know. Yeah. So finally, on the hiring insight, so people who are kind of taking on courses to learn and get into the field and applying for jobs. Some of the things that I have seen over some time is that, so I've done quite a few interviews actually. So more than 10,000 CVs have been screened. And this sounds harsh, but it is true. Majority of those CVs do get rejected in under 15 seconds. And the reason is that there is a pattern that emerges from those CVs. A lot of the CVs have the same stuff, the exact same stuff printed on them. The only thing that's changing is the name. This is keeping aside, I'm not even talking about the junk CVs. You get a lot of junk CVs which have no relevance to the job at all. But keeping those aside, even the ones which have some relevance to the role, even those, they do get rejected because it's exactly the same CV, the same template is being used, the same projects have been done, and there's no depth that is demonstrated within the CV. So I'll come to the depth aspect of this. So before we go to that, a lot of the common aspects that, or the template based what we see in the CVs is because people are doing courses from Coursera and these online available courses, and there's something called the Sparks Foundation internships, which I've been seeing recently pop up a lot more. None of these are bad resources. It's good places to start, but it's important to understand that there's a lot of people doing this. This cannot be the focus of your CV, especially when you're applying for advanced positions where there's a serious amount of technical competency involved. this kind of a CV will get immediately rejected because it's the same as every 5 other CVs that we see out of 7. So it could be a good starting point to kind of learn or get to know about these concepts and topics, but don't keep that as your, the part that you want to present as what you have achieved. That's not an achievement, at least not from a recruiter point of view, because there's too many people who have achieved it. And yeah, so now moving on to what is depth. So whenever we're hiring, we're kind of looking at hiring people who have done some work in the past, which has depth. And what I mean by that is someone who has worked on a problem statement for a long enough time that they are able to understand the intricacies of it. Not just here is a problem with a ready solution to it, and the solution is also something that is readily available to you. So you just look for possible solutions and you say you apply 2, 3 of them, and then you say, okay, this can be done this way, this way, this way, and that's it. So this is a project that has been done, say, for a 3-month period or a 6-month period, and so on. This kind of a thing, it helps. I mean, you can talk about it in an interview. It might get you to the stage of an interview, but it's not enough. So largely the good positions or the good jobs would be looking for something, and it need not be in the same domain. It need not be in data science. It need not be within AI. It could be anything. But it requires some depth of work. At least say, and I don't want to talk about, say, you have to have worked in a particular project for a year. Not necessarily the case. It depends on how many hours you're spending on it. If you spend, say, 15 hours a day on a particular project for 3 months, that would be enough. But you need to be able to demonstrate that depth. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have understood the problem from all angles and you have proposed a solution to it, a solution that works or doesn't work. Either way, you need to know, or you need to be able to demonstrate that you have gone to that level. And kind of, if we are talking about, say, machine learning, if you just take a cue from that, in machine learning, you're looking at history to kind of make judgments about the future. It's the same thing, right? In the hiring process, we are looking at CVs and looking at people's past experiences to kind of make a judgment about their future. So it is very much worthwhile to have something in your history to demonstrate that you have the capacity to go really in depth into a problem and solve a problem with guidance, but not with someone holding your hand through. I would never pass on a project to someone else if I already have a solution to it. It is always the problems that need to be addressed, and I don't have solutions to, would be the ones that would be recruited for. So it's important to understand this. And how do you demonstrate depth of work from past experience? You should know why you've done something, how you've done it, and the how not is also important. Because if you really worked on something in depth, you would know also how not to solve that problem. And to be able to demonstrate that is valuable. Another thing is that multidisciplinary experience, at least personally for me, it is something that I look for. It's very good to see someone who has worked in a different domain and also worked in a completely different domain and has been able to kind of transfer their skills and been successful in different types of roles or different types of domains. That's also a very attractive quality, as long as you can demonstrate the depth. That's important. Yeah, so I mean, this 10x engineer, it's just a thing. I mean, there's no real way to quantify something as someone as a 10x engineer or a 5x engineer or something. It's just kind of like a giving an indication of what is the reality. What we have seen is that someone who is a very good engineer, who has depth of experience in the work that they have done, someone like that can bring far more value than 10 other people who do not have the depth of work, and they can do that in a shorter space of time. It's important to understand this. If you're going into any particular field, aim to be the 10x engineer. An engineer here, again, I'm using it as a very loose term. You need not be an engineer. And another thing that I have seen a lot from the hiring that we have done and a lot of the interviewing, having an engineering degree does not make someone an engineer. Likewise, also someone who does not have an engineering degree could make a very good engineer. It's about how you address problems and see objectives from all angles, the financial angle, the technical angle, the non-technical angle, the communication skills involved, working with people. All of this is important. Just having one aspect of it down does not translate into success. Okay, I think that's about it. Thanks. Might have gone through over time.
Thanks, Asim. Thanks a lot. So any questions till now from anyone? Energy domain, the lag in many, do you see the further developments being towards, there is any So I think this is a question you're talking about the data collection part, right? Like in terms of the SCADA installation in a lot of assets.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, I
the
think
infrastructure that I spoke about, which is already in place, is the big ticket infrastructure like transmission lines and coal power plants and so on. And even those are actually going out of commission. But for the data sourcing itself, there is a lot of growth or development that can happen in the future. Um, IoT is a big thing that's happening now and being deployed massively across the board. We, as a company, are also working within the IoT sector where we are having low-cost solutions to procuring data at places where data does not exist. So there is scope for the data sourcing for sure. In terms of the larger infrastructure is where I was kind of hinting at saying that it's transmission networks are not going to be replaced.
Yeah, so the point being like these assets are already there, right? Like so the things which are being developed right now, like I've also worked in RE Current Energy in the past, and also my previous company was in Renew Power, where we also used to work in terms of data collection from a lot of industries, like even the solar or something. So these infrastructure are being developed, like the digitization. When we talk about like digitization industry, which these power sector is happening there. So a lot of effort is going. The first step is in terms of data collection only. Otherwise, you can't develop applications on top of it if you don't have data sourcing. And a lot of effort is also going to make sure that the data collected is also a right data set, because a lot of hamper also happens at the collection level also. Like sometimes in the
So yeah, that's another point to kind of mention that within SCADA systems, especially, we see a lot of bad quality data, sometimes blatantly incorrect data, and in many occasions missing data. So these are all issues that have to be addressed. So data sourcing and data collection is not a closed chapter in any way.
So, and yes, in India, we are seeing that, like a lot of company are doing that. Okay. Then you to make that privacy.
Yes. Okay. So there are data forecasting is done at a level in which it's currently, if I can say, in India, within the Indian context, we're talking about aggregated data. So within that aggregation, there is masking of individual privacy. In terms of looking within meter and doing analytics on that, there are possibilities of breach of privacy. In an Indian context, I'm not sure there are any regulations stopping this. But globally, yeah, it is possible and it has to be addressed. There is a larger scale privacy that is addressed, that the data is owned by the utility, and the utility ensures that this data is not being used by any entity for any other objective other than whatever the utility objective is. But privacy here is a complicated matter, because even if we say that the data is owned by the utility, having data owned by the consumers is what would ensure true privacy or true kind of control over your own data. But that is not the case. It's a larger problem that is being addressed. I think there was a case against Facebook somewhere in Europe or US where they asked for the company to give back their own data, and the company refused, and there was a lawsuit against it. So ownership of data here is a vague area, especially within the energy sector. We do not own our own energy meter data. The utility owns that data exclusively.
I think the laws are being developed and has been published in like Europe, especially the GDPR laws, and in California states, the data privacy laws, which are coming up in terms of the data ownership. Who's going to take a lot of tabled laws are also there, like in terms of bills which are being written in India, but it has not been made into a law. But we are hoping that it becomes specific to energy. Maybe not sure like how that would play out, but in terms of data ownership, the first thing is in that term, like who owns the data set, even in terms of your personal interaction with the Facebook, whatever you're entering there, who owns that data set. That has to come first in India. Then I think more integrities will come in terms of like energy sector and things like that.
It is certainly an issue, though. I mean, there's scope of abuse there, because with energy disaggregation, it is possible to tell how many people are there within the house, at what time they are entering the house, what time they are leaving the house, and what are their behavioral patterns. So there is definitely an issue with privacy here. I haven't looked at it personally, but I believe if we look into the whatever happened with the implementation of Nest and the ownership of that data with Google, there might be some insights there, but I haven't personally looked at it.
See, the IoT devices, if suppose Google owns your IoT devices, right? Like whatever you are interacting with it, they know that information, and they also have that information from your Google accounts or something, even the location data set. That can be personally linked together, right? That's called fingerprinting of devices. Like just based on they can identify that the people who are using this Wi-Fi to connect this IoT device are also the people who are connecting the Wi-Fi devices using the mobile. So they would know that these are the same people, right? So there are privacy issues which are there, and there are laws, especially in US, California state, and Europe, which are being developed, but it's still a lot to be done in India. Any other question? Any other question regarding like the hiring part or skills and roles? So there are a lot. Like RE Current Energy is one of them, and then there are Climate Connect, there are Renew Power. Someone who owns assets, they work in that domain. Someone like say Renew Power owns the asset in a lot of places. Companies like RE Current Energy provide services to them in terms of analytical services and things like that.
So one, Shell is also an energy company working in this, but not on the power sector domain, in the energy side. So they are on the oil and gas side, but they are transitioning. So kind of, let me add this, that if we talk about the power sector domain, a lot of companies, even the traditional companies, say companies like Renew Power, are slowly thinking about or are already pivoting into digital technologies, because this is where the growth is. This is where they see as the growth is. And probably Rehan can mention a little bit more about within Renew Power what is the thing, but it's happening at larger players like Adani, Total Energy from France. All of the major players are looking at this, as well as the utility companies working in the power sector domain at crossroads with the data and data science and these applications and so on. Shell is definitely one of them.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So if no questions, I'll just give you a brief introduction about OneLearn.io. So as you might have heard, like Aseem talking about a lot of people applying in the company, but they're not able to get into the interviews just because what most people do is like they have done some video courses, they have gone through some blogs and did the same project. Like for example, I'll see like myself when I was interviewing in different companies, right? Like I get to receive hundreds of applications, right? And most of the applications will talk about some of the Kaggle projects, and Titanic being one of them, right? So what happens generally in that case is like it's standardized problem set, right? Like 5 years back, if you were giving me that resume, I would have looked into it and say, okay, this person has done something. But right now, everyone is doing that. Like that's kind of a basic project. Like even an undergrad people or someone who has just who are in the first year of the college, they are doing that, right? So that doesn't create a differentiation. See, the differentiation is like owning the things. Like you need to own the projects which you're doing in terms of the depth also. Like so the prime example which I gave is like, see, nobody is going to hire you or pay you 10 lakh of rupees just to write like scikit-learn code, right? Like implementing logistic regression by importing a library from scikit-learn and writing, doing some hyperparameter tuning and then outputting the result, right? That is just like, what would be that? Like 20 to 30 lines of code, right? Nobody is going to pay you just because of that, right? What the demand in the industry is mostly the people who can think end to end, right? Say suppose you apply in Flipkart, or say suppose I joined a company called Bulbul.tv, right? It's a company which is into video e-commerce. So their primary goal was to increase user engagement. So they didn't come to me and say, okay, Rehan, this is the data set of like my 100 million or my 10 millions of users, and these are the data points. Can you build a recommendation engine? And then I applied a collaborative filtering, like one of the examples of recommendation algorithm, and they gave them the result. That is not how thing works, right? My responsibility there was to strategize, like think of a strategy, what to do in terms of like data collections, right? Like what data will be helping in terms of building recommendation engine, right? What is the approach we should take when the user engagement is very low right now? We are not able to collect a lot of user information right now. Then what is the approach we should be taking in terms of recommendation engine? What happens when when there are a lot of user engagement happening, like when a lot of people are buying products, then how would you take that approach, right? So these are different approaches you need to think of, right? It's not about just applying an algorithm, it's about thinking of how would you roll out the algorithm, what would be the model versioning happen, what happens if your evaluation metrics which you're putting as a metric is not working, how would you take it back, the rollout rollback of the models, right? And it happens iteratively also, like you don't start putting out tens or hundreds of algorithms in the same model, right? You start build it out and see like what is happening, and then you realize maybe this is achieving our business goal, right? So you have to realize that also, like whatever you do, the whole point of data science is like is fulfilling a business objective, and that may be in the case of e-commerce, maybe user engagement, right? And also the higher the user engagement is, higher the revenue the company would generate, right? So it totally ties down back to the like generating revenue for the company, right? So that is how where you have to think it from, right? So what we have done in onelearn.io is like basically tied up with companies like this, right? Like in terms of understanding what their problem statement is, and how do they want candidates to approach the problem. And we have developed the course accordingly, that which will create a differentiation for you in terms of thinking end to end, right? Not just applying the same model. Because if you want to learn just logistic regression, there are hundreds of videos online, right? Like where you can learn what is logistic regression, and you can totally apply using the scikit-learn and then do it. But to think it from that level, end-to-end level, build projects which makes a differentiation in your resume, which I call as a proof of work, right? You have to establish that. See, the basic concepts part establishes the proof of knowledge to you, that when people like Asim sees the resume, and you have mentioned that you have done this course, you have done this project, small projects or single line projects, these kind of things establishes that okay, this person at least understands some of the things. That is a proof of knowledge. But the proof of work will only comes when you demonstrate doing projects which will create a differentiation, right? And which is mostly the end-to-end projects, which will also show the proof of depth also, that you have some depth in that particular domain. You can think of when the model is working, when the project is working, when it is going to fail, what kind of data is needed, what were the business objectives, how do we achieve that, right? It maybe instead of applying a machine learning algorithm, it maybe a simple statistics can achieve that business algorithm, right? Then you go to that direction. It's not necessary that you should apply deep learning only, right? That's a hype. Don't follow the hype, follow the business objective that you want to solve. So that approach you need to build upon, and we have designed the course accordingly. That so if anyone is interested, I would just share the application here. You can just reply here, and I can discuss one-on-one with you also, like in terms of the course curriculum and how we are going to conduct the course. Okay. Any questions till now? And by the way, we conduct these sessions every weekend. So the next session would be in terms of marketing models, like companies like consultancy companies, how they are working. So I'll share the invitation for that also. So any questions till now? I have shared the link where you can apply. I'll also share it in the email also to every one of you. If there is no question, I think we can end there. Thanks, Asim.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.